What part of the world are you watching from right now? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Shattered Dreams. James Morrison's fingers tightened around the divorce papers, the expensive paper crinkling under his grip as he watched the sprinklers soak his clothing scattered across the lawn. Each droplet of water struck another memory: his favorite blue dress shirt from their anniversary dinner in Paris, the custom-tailored suit from their last Christmas party, the silk tie Rebecca had given him when he'd launched Biotech Solutions. The mechanical clicking of the sprinklers provided a steady rhythm to his racing thoughts. He'd maintained this lawn meticulously for 15 years, spending countless Sunday mornings ensuring every blade of grass was perfect, just as Rebecca had wanted. Now it served as the stage for his public humiliation. Still standing there like a lost puppy? Rebecca's voice cut through his thoughts. She stood in the doorway of their colonial-style house. Now her house. Her manicured fingers intertwined with those of Richard Sterling. The real estate mogul's presence beside her was like a carefully calculated insult, his designer suit and artificially whitened smile speaking of old money and privilege. James studied Richard's face, noting the slight sag of jowls that his expensive skincare routine couldn't quite hide, the beginning of age spots that betrayed his true years despite the carefully maintained salt and pepper hair. At 45, Richard Sterling carried himself with the arrogance of inherited wealth, though James had done his homework. The Sterling empire was built on quicksand, leveraged properties, questionable permits, and enough debt to sink a small country. "You should be thanking me, James." Rebecca's voice dripped with false sympathy, her red lips curving into a practiced smile. "I'm being more than generous. I'm not taking a penny from you." She paused, her next words calculated for maximum impact. "God knows you don't have any to spare anyway." James remained silent, his mind methodically cataloging every detail of this moment. The way Rebecca's hand squeezed Richard's arm possessively, the smug satisfaction in her eyes, the slight tremor in her voice that betrayed her nervousness beneath the confident exterior. 6 months of betrayal played through his mind like a well-edited movie. The sudden, emergency meetings, the weekend business trips, the strategic emptying of their joint accounts. He'd been blind, too consumed with his work at Biotech Solutions, too trusting in their 15 years together. 18-hour days in the lab had left him vulnerable, distracted. By the time he'd noticed the signs, Rebecca had already executed her exit strategy. "The papers are signed," James said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that made Rebecca's smile falter slightly. "You got what you wanted." Richard's laugh echoed across the lawn, artificial and hollow. He pulled Rebecca closer, his expensive watch glinting in the morning sun. "Face it, Morrison, you're a nobody. Always have been, always will be." His voice hardened. "Now get off my property before I call the police." James raised an eyebrow, the first genuine expression he'd shown. "Your property?" "Wedding gift," Rebecca interjected, her smile widening. "Richard bought it last week. Quite generous of him, don't you think?" James nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving their faces. He committed every detail to memory: the slight flush of triumph on Rebecca's cheeks, the possessive way Richard's hand rested on her waist, the casual cruelty in their shared laughter. These details would fuel him in the months to come. Walking to his Honda Civic, the only asset Rebecca had, generously left him, James felt their eyes on his back, waiting for him to break, to show some sign of defeat. The car was a deliberate insult, of course. Rebecca could have taken it too, but she'd left it as a reminder of his fall from grace. Inside the car, James pulled out his phone, his fingers steady as he dialed a number he'd memorized weeks ago. "Dr. Patterson? It's James Morrison." He paused, listening to the response. "Yes, I've made my decision. Tell the board I accept their offer." Another pause. "But I have one condition. Absolute secrecy until the deal closes." As he ended the call, James caught a glimpse of Rebecca and Richard in his rearview mirror. They stood in the doorway of his former home, their poses reminiscent of an expensive real estate advertisement, the perfect couple in their perfect house. But James saw past the facade. He saw the hairline cracks in their armor, the weaknesses they didn't even know they had. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he pulled away from the curb, his mind already racing ahead to the next phase of his plan. They thought they'd broken him, reduced him to nothing. They'd soon learn how dangerous it was to underestimate James Morrison. The Honda's engine protested as he accelerated, but James barely noticed. His thoughts were already elsewhere, mapping out the moves ahead like a chess grandmaster. Rebecca and Richard had played their game well, but they'd forgotten one crucial detail. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who appears to have nothing left to lose. As he drove toward his temporary apartment, James allowed himself a small smile. They'd taught him valuable lessons about trust, about loyalty, about the true nature of people. Now it was time to show them what an apt pupil he'd been. The buzzing of his phone interrupted his thoughts. A text from Rebecca: "Left some of your precious research notes in the garage. Having them hauled to the dump tomorrow. Consider it a final parting gift." James didn't respond. He didn't need to. The notes were decoys anyway, carefully crafted fakes he'd planted weeks ago when he'd first discovered their affair. The real research, the breakthrough that would change everything, was safely stored in multiple secure locations. Rebecca and Richard thought they were dealing with a naive scientist, too absorbed in his work to see their betrayal coming. They'd never bothered to look deeper, to see the steel beneath the lab coat. He pulled into the parking lot of his new apartment building, a deliberately modest complex that matched their perception of his financial status. Another piece in the elaborate game he was constructing. Let them think they'd reduced him to living in a second-rate apartment. Let them believe their victory was complete. Inside his apartment, James stood in the sparse living room, surrounded by boxes he hadn't bothered to unpack. He didn't need to. This place was temporary, just like their triumph. He pulled out his laptop and began typing, his fingers flying over the keys as he documented every detail of the day's events. Each word was another brick in the foundation of his revenge. A notification popped up on his screen. An email from his lawyer confirming the transfer of his remaining assets to a series of shell companies. Rebecca's thorough pillaging of their joint accounts had actually worked in his favor, providing a perfect cover for his own financial movements. She'd been so focused on taking everything visible that she'd never thought to look for what was hidden. James closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Rebecca and Richard were probably celebrating their victory, drinking expensive champagne and laughing at his expense. Let them laugh. Let them bask in their moment of triumph. He'd learned from them, learned about patience, about timing, about the importance of appearing weak when you were strong. But unlike them, he wasn't motivated by simple greed or lust. His motivation was purer, more focused. They tried to destroy everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for. Now they would learn the cost of such arrogance. The sun was setting over the city as James began making his next set of calls. Each conversation was brief, precise, laying the groundwork for what was to come. By the time darkness fell, the pieces were in motion. Rebecca and Richard had won the first battle, but they didn't realize the war had only just begun. In their arrogance, they'd created their own worst enemy, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. A man who would show them exactly how expensive betrayal could be. Chapter 2. The Long Game. 3 months before the divorce papers landed on his lawn, James Morrison sat across from Dr. Catherine Patterson in his lab at Biotech Solutions, watching her expression change as she reviewed his research data. The head of research at PharmaCorp, one of the country's largest pharmaceutical companies, had arrived unannounced that morning, her presence sending ripples of speculation through the small startup. This is... Dr. Patterson paused, her eyes scanning the data for the third time. This is revolutionary, James. The delivery system you've developed. It could change everything we know about targeted cancer treatment. She looked up at him, her professional demeanor cracking slightly to reveal genuine amazement. How have you kept this under wraps? James leaned back in his chair, his lab coat wrinkled from another 18-hour day. When everyone thinks you're a failure, it's easy to fly under the radar. He gestured to the modest lab around them. Nobody pays attention to the small startup running on fumes. Nobody looks too closely at the scientist working late hours on what they assume is a dead end. Dr. Patterson set down the tablet containing his research data. You realize what this is worth? The potential applications alone. She shook her head. Every major pharmaceutical company will be fighting for this technology once it goes public. If it goes public, James corrected her quietly. I'm not ready for that yet. There are still tests to run, protocols to verify. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. And there are personal matters to consider. Personal matters? Dr. Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't reached her position by missing subtle cues. James stood and walked to the lab's small window, looking out at the parking lot where Rebecca's BMW sat next to his Honda. Let's just say timing is everything, Dr. Patterson. Both in science and in life. The conversation shifted to technical details, dosage rates, delivery mechanisms, potential side effects. But throughout the discussion, James could see the wheels turning behind Dr. Patterson's professional facade. She wasn't just evaluating the science. She was evaluating him. That night, after Dr. Patterson left with a non-disclosure agreement and a promise to continue their discussion, James sat alone in his lab, running another set of simulations. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Working late again? Don't wait up. Meeting with clients. He typed back a simple okay, knowing she wouldn't be meeting clients. The private investigator he'd hired had already confirmed her regular Wednesday night rendezvous with Richard Sterling at the Madison Hotel, the same hotel where, ironically, they'd celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary 3 years ago. James turned back to his computer, the blue light of the screen reflecting off his glasses as he reviewed the preliminary trial data. The results were better than even he had anticipated. The targeted delivery system wasn't just effective, it was revolutionary. Cancer treatment without the devastating side effects of traditional chemotherapy. Precise, efficient, and most importantly, patentable. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Rebecca. Don't forget to transfer money for the landscaper. The lawn needs work. James smiled slightly. The lawn had become Rebecca's obsession lately, an excuse to drain their joint accounts bit by bit. $10,000 for new sod. $8,000 for a sophisticated irrigation system. Another $5,000 for professional landscaping. She thought she was being clever, preparing her exit strategy while he remained absorbed in his work. What Rebecca didn't know was that James had been preparing too. Every withdrawal she made, every account she drained, was carefully documented. Every business meeting with Richard Sterling was photographed and time-stamped. Every fraudulent loan application she helped process at Sterling Properties was archived. The next morning, James arrived early at the lab, reviewing the security footage from the previous night. He'd installed the cameras himself, hidden carefully throughout the facility. The official reason was to protect his research. The real reason was to catch what happened after hours. Right on schedule, the footage showed Rebecca entering the lab at 11:47 p.m., using the key she'd insisted on having in case of emergencies. She went straight to his office, spending 20 minutes going through his files and photographing documents with her phone. James switched to another camera angle, watching as she downloaded files from his computer onto a USB drive. The computer was a decoy, of course, containing only outdated research data and deliberately misleading results. The real breakthrough was secured elsewhere, protected by encryption that would make government agencies envious. His phone rang. Dr. Patterson again. James, I've spoken with the board. They're interested, very interested. But they need to know your terms. James watched the footage of Rebecca leaving his lab, her expression triumphant as she clutched the USB drive. $500 million, Dr. Patterson. Non-negotiable. Plus a position heading the research division, once the acquisition is complete. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's aggressive. It's fair, James replied calmly. You've seen the data. You know what this technology is worth. $500 million is actually conservative, considering the market potential. Another pause. The board will want independent verification of the results. Naturally, I'll provide access to all necessary data and trials. But everything stays completely confidential until the deal closes. No public announcements, no SEC filings, nothing that could tip our hand. You're worried about competing offers? James thought about Rebecca and Richard, about their smug certainty that they were always the smartest people in the room. No, Dr. Patterson. I'm worried about people who might try to interfere with the deal for personal reasons. After ending the call, James pulled up the latest report from his private investigator. Richard Sterling's empire was exactly what James had suspected. a house of cards built on leveraged properties and fraudulent loans. The man portrayed himself as old money, but his wealth was as fake as his perfectly capped teeth. More importantly, Rebecca was deeply involved in the fraud. As a loan officer at First National, she'd been helping Richard secure financing using the same properties as collateral for multiple loans. It was clever, but it was also highly illegal. James leaned back in his chair, calculating his next moves. The pieces were all in place: the breakthrough technology, the acquisition offer, the evidence of fraud. Now it was just a matter of timing. His computer chimed with an email notification. Rebecca, forwarding an invoice for another landscaping project. The back garden needs work, her message read. I've already approved the estimate. Only $30,000 for a complete redesign. James approved the transfer without hesitation. Let her think she was winning. Let her drain the accounts. Everything she took was just another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin she was building for herself. That evening, he worked late again, knowing Rebecca would be meeting Richard. Through his contacts, he'd learned they were celebrating Richard's latest real estate deal, a luxury condo development built on protected wetlands. The environmental impact studies had been buried, the permits fast-tracked through friendly city officials. James made another note in his growing file. Richard's empire wasn't just built on financial fraud. It was built on a foundation of bribes, falsified documents, and environmental violations. Each piece of evidence was a weapon, waiting to be deployed at the perfect moment. His phone buzzed with another text from Rebecca. Don't forget my charity gala tomorrow night. Wear the blue suit. James responded with a simple okay, knowing he wouldn't be attending. Instead, he'd be meeting with Mason Hayes, a former Wall Street analyst who owed him a favor. Years ago, James had helped prove Mason was framed for insider trading, though they'd kept the evidence private. Now it was time to call in that debt. As he prepared to leave the lab, James caught his reflection in the window. Rebecca had always criticized his appearance, too focused on work, too casual, not polished enough for her social circle. She'd never understood that his unassuming exterior was a carefully constructed facade. Tomorrow, Rebecca would attend her gala on Richard's arm, playing the role of the elegant socialite. She would laugh with her friends, share knowing looks with Richard, and congratulate herself on executing her escape plan so perfectly. And James? He would be laying the groundwork for their destruction, piece by careful piece. They thought they were writing the end of his story. They didn't realize they were only setting up the beginning of his. Chapter 3. Pieces in Motion. James sat in his lab, reviewing the latest batch of test results when his phone buzzed with a message from Mason Hayes. The former Wall Street analyst had been working tirelessly for the past week, digging through Richard Sterling's complex web of financial dealings. Found something big, Mason's message read. Need to meet in person. Usual place, 1 hour. James glanced at his watch, 9:30 p.m. The timing was perfect. Rebecca would be at her weekly yoga class, which was code for her rendezvous with Richard at the Madison Hotel. Her predictability had become one of his greatest assets. The usual place was a small coffee shop in a quiet part of town, the kind of establishment that attracted more laptops than conversations. James arrived early, choosing a corner table that gave him a clear view of both entrances. Mason arrived precisely on time, his disheveled appearance a stark contrast to his sharp intelligence. He carried a worn leather briefcase that had seen better days, much like its owner. After ordering coffee, he sat down across from James, his eyes darting around the nearly empty cafe. You weren't kidding about Sterling Properties, Mason said in a low voice, pulling out his laptop. The whole thing is built on quicksand. Look at this. He turned the screen toward James, displaying a complex diagram of interconnected companies and properties. James leaned forward, studying the information. Tell me. Richard's been using the same properties as collateral for multiple loans, Mason explained, his fingers flying over the keyboard to pull up various documents. He takes out a loan using property A as collateral, then uses the same property as collateral for another loan at a different bank. The paperwork is altered just enough to avoid immediate detection. And Rebecca's role in this? Mason's expression turned grim. She's neck-deep in it. As a loan officer at First National, she's been pushing through fraudulent applications, falsifying documentation. I found at least 12 properties that have been used multiple times as collateral. We're talking hundreds of millions in fraudulent loans. James nodded slowly, processing the information. The banks haven't caught on? Sterling's got half the city council in his pocket, Mason replied, pulling up more documents. Building inspectors, zoning officials, even a judge or two. The whole system is greased to look the other way. That's counting on them staying in his pocket, James mused, his mind already racing ahead. What happens when the money stops flowing? Mason looked up sharply. That's the thing, James. It's already starting to crack. Sterling's overleveraged. He's running out of properties to use as collateral, and the interest payments are piling up. One wrong move, one bank getting suspicious, and the whole house of cards comes down. James sat back, taking a sip of his now cold coffee. How long would it take to compile all this evidence? Something that would stand up in court? Give me 2 weeks, Mason said, closing his laptop. But James, this is dangerous territory. Sterling's got friends in high places. If he figures out what we're doing, he won't, James interrupted quietly. He's too busy celebrating his victory. People like Richard and Rebecca, they never look behind them. They're always focused on their next conquest, their next scheme. After Mason left, James made another call, this time to Isabella Martinez, a tenacious investigative reporter he'd met years ago at a tech conference. She'd been trying to expose corruption in local real estate development for years, but could never quite get the smoking gun she needed. They met the next day in a small park, far from their usual haunts. Isabella hadn't changed much. Still carried the same battered notebook, still had that hungry look in her eyes that all good journalists possessed. I'm not looking for revenge, James told her, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. He slid a USB drive across the bench between them. I'm looking for justice. Everything you need is here, proof of bribes, falsified environmental reports, endangered species surveys buried to fast-track developments. Isabella studied him carefully, turning the drive over in her hands. This isn't like you, James. You've always been the nice guy, the peacemaker. People change, he answered simply. Sometimes they have to. The rest of the meeting was brief, professional. Isabella would take her time, verify everything independently, build an ironclad case. James didn't need to rush her. The pieces were already in motion. That evening, James returned to his lab, reviewing the latest data from his cancer treatment trials. The results continued to exceed expectations. Soon, PharmaCorp would announce the acquisition, and the first domino would fall. His phone buzzed. Another text from Rebecca. The landscapers need another $10,000 for the water feature. I've already approved it. Try not to work too late, dear. You look terrible when you're tired. James smiled slightly as he approved the transfer. Every dollar she took, every casual cruelty she inflicted, was another piece of evidence. Another reason for what was to come. He opened his laptop and began typing his daily log, documenting every interaction, every transaction, every piece of the puzzle he was assembling. Richard and Rebecca thought they were writing the final chapter of his story. They didn't realize they were only setting up the prologue of their own downfall. The lab was quiet except for the hum of equipment and the soft clicking of keys as James worked. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, unaware of the storm brewing beneath its surface. In high-rise offices and luxury penthouses, people like Richard Sterling played their games of power and privilege, believing themselves untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. James glanced at his watch, nearly midnight. In a few hours, he had a breakfast meeting with Dr. Patterson to finalize the acquisition details. After that, a series of carefully orchestrated meetings would set the next phase of his plan in motion. He powered down his computer and gathered his things, his movements deliberate and unhurried. There was no need to rush. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Richard and Rebecca had taught him valuable lessons about patience, about the importance of timing, about the true nature of power. Now it was time to show them what an apt pupil he'd been. Chapter 1. Hidden Moves. The morning after signing the divorce papers, James sat in his modest apartment, surrounded by 3 laptops displaying different aspects of his plan. The first showed Mason Hayes's preliminary findings on Sterling properties. The second tracked Rebecca's systematic draining of their accounts, and the third contained the encrypted files of his cancer treatment breakthrough. His phone buzzed with a message from Mason. Meeting in 20. Found something big. James arrived at their usual coffee shop ahead of schedule, choosing a corner table that offered a clear view of both entrances. Mason hurried in, his excitement visible despite his attempt to maintain a professional demeanor. "You won't believe what I found," Mason said, opening his laptop. "Sterling's been using the same properties as collateral for multiple loans. Look at this." He turned the screen, displaying a complex web of transactions. He takes out a loan using property A as collateral, then uses the same property for another loan at a different bank. The documentation is altered just enough to avoid immediate detection. James studied the diagram, his expression neutral. "And Rebecca's involvement?" "She's been instrumental," Mason replied, pulling up more documents. "As a loan officer at First National, she's been pushing through fraudulent applications, falsifying documentation. I've identified 12 properties that have been used multiple times as collateral. We're talking about hundreds of millions in fraudulent loans. Evidence?" Mason nodded, plugging in a secure drive. "Everything's here: loan applications, altered property assessments, falsified income statements. Rebecca's fingerprints are all over it. She wasn't just helping Richard. She was actively participating in the fraud." James absorbed the information, his mind already calculating the next moves. "What about Richard's other projects?" "That's where it gets interesting." Mason leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Remember that luxury condo development he's been bragging about? The one on the old industrial site? The environmental impact studies were buried. The soil tests showed dangerous levels of contamination, but they paid off inspectors to look the other way." James's phone vibrated. A text from Rebecca. "Found more of your research equipment in the garage. Having it hauled away tomorrow. Consider it gone." He ignored the message, focusing on Mason's findings. "How long to compile everything into a formal report?" "Give me 2 weeks," Mason replied. "But James, we need to be careful. Sterling's got connections in the city council, the planning department, even the judiciary." "Let him have his connections," James said, his voice cold. "They're only loyal as long as the money flows. What happens to rats when they realize the ship is sinking?" After Mason left, James made another call. Isabella Martinez answered on the first ring. "Tell me you have something good," she said by way of greeting. "Better than good," James replied. "How would you like to break the biggest real estate corruption story of the decade?" They met an hour later in a quiet park. Isabella hadn't changed since their last meeting, still carried her battered notebook, still had that hungry look that marked all good investigative journalists. "Everything you need is here," James said, handing her a secure drive. Environmental violations, buried reports, proof of bribes paid to city officials. Focus on the Riverside Condos project first. The contamination cover-up will get people's attention. Isabella studied him carefully. "This is comprehensive, James. How long have you been gathering this?" "Long enough," he replied. "The question is, can you use it?" "Oh, I can use it." Isabella's eyes gleamed. "But Richard Sterling has friends at the paper. They've killed stories about him before." "Not this time," James assured her. "This story won't just run in your paper. It'll run simultaneously in 3 major outlets. I've arranged it already." Isabella raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy. You have no idea." Back in his apartment, James reviewed the acquisition paperwork from PharmaCorp. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Dr. Patterson had secured board approval, and the lawyers were finalizing the details. $500 million, enough to make business news headlines, enough to show Rebecca and Richard exactly what they tried to throw away. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Rebecca. "The landscapers need another $20,000 for the new irrigation system. I've already approved it. Don't work too late, dear. You look terrible when you're tired." James smiled slightly as he approved the transfer. Each withdrawal, each casual insult, was another piece of evidence. Another nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. He opened his secure laptop and began updating his daily log. Everything was documented, every transaction, every interaction, every piece of evidence. Richard and Rebecca thought they were dealing with a defeated man, too broken by betrayal to fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. A notification popped up. Mason had sent another batch of documents. This time, it was evidence of Richard's connections to city officials. Payments routed through shell companies, favorable zoning decisions, expedited permits. The web of corruption was even more extensive than James had anticipated. He forwarded select documents to Isabella, knowing she would understand their significance. The rest he saved for later, ammunition to be used at precisely the right moment. His phone rang. Dr. Patterson. James, the board wants to fast-track the announcement. They're excited about the technology. No, he said firmly. We stick to the original timeline. Everything has to happen in the right order. Does this have something to do with your ex-wife and Richard Sterling? James paused, choosing his words carefully. Let's just say timing is crucial. Trust me, Catherine. When this is done, PharmaCorp won't just have a revolutionary cancer treatment. You'll have eliminated a potential competitor before they even knew they were in the game. After ending the call, James pulled up the security footage from his lab. Right on schedule, Rebecca appeared, using her key to enter the facility. She went straight to his office, spending 20 minutes photographing documents and downloading files. The computer she was accessing was a decoy, of course, loaded with outdated research data and deliberately misleading results. The real breakthrough was secured elsewhere, protected by encryption that would make government agencies envious. A new email arrived, surveillance photos from the private investigator he'd hired. Rebecca and Richard at their regular Wednesday night meeting at the Madison Hotel. They looked triumphant, celebrating their victory over drinks in the hotel bar. James saved the photos to his evidence file. Let them celebrate. Let them think they'd won. Their arrogance would make their fall even more spectacular. He turned to another laptop, reviewing Mason's latest findings. Richard's empire wasn't just built on fraud. It was a pyramid scheme of epic proportions. Each new project was funded by loans secured against previous properties that had already been used as collateral multiple times. More importantly, Rebecca wasn't just a participant in the fraud. She was a key enabler. Her position at First National had allowed Richard to secure loans that would never have been approved otherwise. She'd falsified documents, manipulated appraisals, and buried due diligence reports that would have exposed the scheme. James began composing a detailed timeline of their activities, cross-referencing dates and transactions. Their betrayal had taught him valuable lessons about patience, about the importance of timing, about the true nature of power. Now it was time to show them what an apt pupil he'd been. Chapter 2. The Turning Point. The morning the acquisition announcement was scheduled to break, James arrived early at PharmaCorp's headquarters. Dr. Patterson had insisted he take a leading role in the research division, recognizing not just his brilliant mind but his strategic thinking. His new office, with its view of the city skyline, was a far cry from his modest lab at Biotech Solutions. But it wasn't the luxury that satisfied him. It was knowing that within hours, Rebecca and Richard's carefully constructed world would begin to crumble. The press release goes out at 9, Dr. Patterson said, entering his office with a tablet displaying the final version. Are you ready for this? James nodded, reviewing the document one last time. The numbers were staggering: $500 million for Biotech Solutions, plus a guaranteed research budget of $200 million over the next 5 years. More than enough to make headlines. More than enough to shatter certain people's perceptions. The board wants you to do a press conference next week, Dr. Patterson continued. Your breakthrough could revolutionize cancer treatment. People will want to hear from the mind behind it. Schedule it, James replied. But make sure it's after the quarterly earnings reports for financial institutions. Dr. Patterson raised an eyebrow, but didn't question his timing. She'd learned over the past few months that James Morrison never did anything without a reason. At precisely 9 o'clock, the announcement went live. James watched as the news spread across financial networks, his phone beginning to buzz with notifications. First came the congratulatory messages from colleagues, then the investment analysts wanting comments, and finally, right on schedule, the increasingly desperate text from Rebecca. We need to talk. James, please call me. This isn't funny anymore. You planned this, didn't you? He let each message go unanswered, focusing instead on the financial news coverage. The acquisition was being hailed as a major coup for PharmaCorp, their stock price already climbing on the news. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas Wright, Richard's biggest investor, stood in the doorway, his expensive suit and gold cufflinks unable to hide his obvious anxiety. "Do you have a moment, Dr. Morrison?" Wright asked, his usual confidence notably absent. James gestured to a chair, his expression neutral. "Of course, Mr. Wright. What can I do for you?" Wright fidgeted with his cufflinks, a nervous tell that James filed away for future reference. "I'm hearing some concerning things about Sterling Properties. Irregularities in the books, possible fraud. Given your history with Richard, I thought you might have some insight." "I'm afraid I can't help you," James replied, his voice professionally detached. "I'm just a scientist who got lucky with a medical breakthrough. Real estate isn't my area of expertise." "Please," Wright leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "I have $50 million invested in Sterling's latest development. If there's anything you know, perhaps you should be asking these questions of Mr. Sterling," James suggested. "Or his loan officer at First National. I believe you know her, Rebecca Morrison?" Wright's face paled slightly at the mention of Rebecca's name. "Yes, well, thank you for your time, Dr. Morrison." After Wright left, James made a call to Mason. "Thomas Wright just paid me a visit. Make sure our friends at the SEC get the documentation about his involvement in the Riverside project, particularly the parts about the contamination cover-up." "Already done," Mason replied. "The dominoes are starting to fall, James. 3 other investors have pulled out of Sterling's projects this morning." James ended the call and turned to his computer, pulling up the latest report from his investigative team. Richard's empire was beginning to show cracks. Banks were asking questions about collateral, investors were demanding audits, and environmental groups were staging protests at his construction sites. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Isabella. "The story runs tomorrow," she said without preamble. "Front page, full spread. We've got confirmation from 2 other outlets. They're running it simultaneously." "Any pushback from Sterling's friends at the paper?" "They tried." Isabella's satisfaction was evident in her voice. "But when the editor saw the evidence about the contaminated soil and the buried reports, he couldn't kill it. The liability would have been too great." James smiled slightly. "Good. Make sure the sidebar about First National's involvement is prominent. The banking regulators should find it interesting." The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and interviews. James played his role perfectly, the brilliant but humble scientist, focused solely on the potential of his medical breakthrough to help people. No one suspected that he was simultaneously orchestrating the destruction of a real estate empire. Late that afternoon, another visitor arrived. Richard's lawyer, David Chun. The man's usual smug expression was replaced by barely concealed panic. "Mr. Sterling would like to discuss a settlement," Chun began, attempting to project confidence. "He's willing to be generous." James leaned back in his chair, studying the lawyer with cold amusement. "A settlement for what, Mr. Chin? I'm not suing Richard. I'm not doing anything to Richard. I'm simply a scientist who developed a promising medical treatment." "We both know that's not true." Chin's veneer of professionalism cracked slightly. These anonymous tips to regulators, the sudden investor exodus, the environmental protests, it all started after the divorce. "Correlation doesn't imply causation," James replied calmly. "Isn't that what lawyers always say? Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with our research team." As Chin left, James received another text from Rebecca. "You think you're clever, don't you? Richard has friends in high places. They'll bury your precious research, destroy your reputation." James forwarded the message to his lawyer, adding it to the growing file of evidence. Let them make threats. Let them try to fight back. He'd anticipated every move, prepared for every contingency. His phone rang again, Mason with more updates. The dominoes were falling faster now. 2 banks had frozen Sterling's credit lines, demanding immediate audits. Environmental regulators had issued stop-work orders on 3 major projects. Investors were filing lawsuits. James ended the call and stood at his window, looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, Rebecca and Richard were watching their carefully constructed world collapse. They'd thought they were the architects of destruction, but they were about to learn a painful lesson about the price of underestimating their enemies. Chapter 3. Counterattack. Richard Sterling was not a man accustomed to defeat. As his empire began to crumble, he launched a desperate counteroffensive, starting with a vicious smear campaign against James. Breakthrough scientist accused of research theft. The headline screamed across local news websites. A former employee of Biotech Solutions had come forward, claiming James had stolen the revolutionary cancer treatment research from him. James read the article with clinical detachment in his PharmaCorp office, noting the careful wording that stayed just shy of actionable libel. Richard had good lawyers, expensive lawyers, but they were fighting a battle James had prepared for months ago. "They're pushing the story hard," Dr. Patterson said, entering his office with a concerned expression. "The board wants to know if there's any truth to it." James turned his computer screen toward her, displaying a sequence of video logs. "Every step of the research is documented here. Daily logs, witnessed by independent observers. Equipment readouts, trial data, everything backed up in triple redundancy." He pulled up another file. "And here's the interesting part. The whistleblower Mr. Chin found? Dr. Marcus Webb. Check his bank records for the past week." Dr. Patterson's eyes widened as she reviewed the documents. $800,000 deposited 2 days ago? From a shell company linked to Sterling Properties. "Richard's getting sloppy," James observed. "Desperate people make mistakes." His phone buzzed. Isabella Martinez. "Webb's credibility is shot," she reported. "We found 3 previous instances where he sold false testimony in patent disputes. The story's already being retracted by most outlets. Make sure the retractions mention the payment from Sterling Shell Company," James instructed. "And copy everything to the SEC investigators." No sooner had he ended that call than his lawyer, Sarah Zhang, called with more news. "Rebecca's lawyers filed a motion to reopen the divorce settlement," she reported. "They're claiming you concealed the true value of Biotech Solutions during the proceedings." James allowed himself a small smile. "Perfect. Send them our response package." The response package was a meticulously prepared document that had been waiting for precisely this moment. It contained detailed records of Rebecca's systematic draining of their joint accounts, evidence of her involvement in Richard's fraudulent loan schemes, and proof that she'd attempted to steal and sell James's research data. "There's more," Sarah continued. "They're trying to claim she contributed to the company's success through emotional and financial support. They want a percentage of the acquisition price." "Interesting approach," James replied. "Send the surveillance footage from the lab, the videos of her breaking in to steal research data. Add the documented transfers showing how she drained the company accounts. Oh, and don't forget the timestamped photos from the Madison Hotel. Let's see how a judge responds to her claims of support." The next few days were a blur of legal maneuvers and countermaneuvers. Richard's lawyers filed motion after motion, each more desperate than the last. James met each attack with calm precision, always one step ahead, always with damning evidence ready to deploy. "They're getting desperate," Mason reported during their daily update. "Sterling tried to move assets offshore last night. We caught it and froze the transfers. The banks are closing in." James nodded, reviewing the latest financial reports. "And Rebecca? She's been placed on administrative leave at First National. Internal audit found irregularities in her loan approvals. They're cooperating with regulators now." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Patterson entered, holding a tablet. "James, Richard Sterling is in the lobby. He's demanding to see you." "Perfect timing," James said, standing. "Mason, send everything we have on the Riverside project to the EPA. It's time to accelerate the timeline." "Are you sure you want to see him?" Dr. Patterson asked, concern evident in her voice. "Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world," James replied. "Have security ready, but let him up." Minutes later, Richard Sterling burst into the office, his expensive suit wrinkled, his usual polished appearance showing signs of strain. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights, and his hands trembled slightly as he pointed at James. "You smug bastard," Richard snarled. "You think you're so clever with your little schemes? I built this city. I own half the people in it." James remained seated, his posture relaxed. "Owned, Richard. Past tense. It's amazing how quickly loyalty evaporates when the SEC starts asking questions. This is about Rebecca, isn't it? Richard laughed, but there was an edge of hysteria to it. You're destroying everything I built because your wife decided to trade up? No, Richard, James replied calmly. This is about consequences. You and Rebecca thought you could take everything from me, break me, humiliate me. You never stopped to consider that I might fight back. Fight back? Richard's voice rose. You're not fighting. You're destroying lives. My investors, my projects, my reputation. Your fraudulent loans? James interrupted. Your buried environmental reports? The bribes to city officials? Tell me, Richard, did you really think you could keep juggling all those balls forever? Richard's face paled. How did you know everything? James stood slowly. I've known for months. Every scheme, every fraud, every double dealing. I watched you and Rebecca celebrate your victory while I gathered evidence. I let you think you'd won while I prepared to take everything from you. I'll destroy you, Richard threatened, but his voice lacked conviction. I have connections. Had connections, James corrected. Check your phone, Richard. The EPA just announced an investigation into the Riverside project. The FBI is executing search warrants at Sterling Properties offices across the city. Your connections are running for cover. As if on cue, Richard's phone began buzzing incessantly. His face went from pale to ashen as he read the messages. You're finished, Richard, James said quietly. Your empire is collapsing. Your investors are fleeing. Your banks are calling in their loans. And Rebecca? She's about to learn the cost of betrayal. Security arrived to escort a shell-shocked Richard from the building. James watched him go, feeling not triumph but a cold satisfaction. The real endgame was still to come. His phone buzzed with a message from Isabella. Stories going live in all major outlets tomorrow. FBI raids, EPA investigation, banking fraud. It's all coming out. Want a comment? No comment needed, James replied. The evidence speaks for itself. He turned back to his computer, reviewing the final pieces of his plan. Richard and Rebecca had taught him valuable lessons about ruthlessness, about the importance of timing, about the true nature of power. Now they would learn the price of those lessons. The coming days would bring federal investigations, indictments, and the complete collapse of Sterling Properties. But for James, this was never about revenge. It was about justice, served cold and calculated. He picked up a framed photo from his desk, the last picture taken of him and Rebecca together, both smiling at a charity gala. He dropped it into the shredder, watching as their frozen smiles disappeared into confetti. The game was nearly over, and James Morrison had played every move perfectly. Chapter 1. House of Cards. James Morrison sat in his PharmaCorp office, watching multiple screens as the carefully orchestrated destruction of Sterling Properties unfolded. FBI agents swarmed the company's headquarters, carrying boxes of documents and hard drives. On another screen, Richard Sterling's face twisted in rage as federal agents led him through his own lobby in handcuffs. The raids are synchronized across 6 locations, Mason reported, his laptop displaying a map with blinking red dots. They're hitting every Sterling Properties office simultaneously. No chance for document destruction. Isabella's expose had broken that morning across 3 major news outlets. The headlines were devastating. Real estate empire built on fraud. Sterling Properties, a web of corruption. Environmental crimes and financial fraud. The fall of Richard Sterling. James's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Patterson. Board meeting in 20 minutes. They want an update on the new research facility. Tell them I'll be there, he replied, his attention still fixed on the screens. The raid footage showed Rebecca being escorted from First National Bank. She tried to run, attempting to delete files and shred documents when the investigators arrived. But James had anticipated that move. Every file, every transaction, every piece of evidence had already been backed up and provided to federal authorities. Mr. Morrison? His assistant's voice came through the intercom. Agent Sarah Chun from the FBI is here to see you. Send her in. Agent Chin entered, her FBI windbreaker still dusty from the raids. Dr. Morrison, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. The evidence you provided was instrumental. James gestured to a chair. I'm just a concerned citizen, Agent Chen. When I discovered evidence of financial fraud and environmental violations, I had a duty to report it. A concerned citizen who happens to be the ex-husband of one of the primary suspects, Chen noted, studying his reaction. A coincidence that I'm sure Ms. Morrison's lawyers will try to exploit, James replied calmly. But the evidence speaks for itself. The fraudulent loans, the environmental cover-ups, the bribery. None of that has anything to do with our divorce. Chen nodded, pulling out her notebook. We found something interesting in the preliminary search. Documents showing Ms. Morrison accessed confidential research data from biotech solutions after your separation. Any comment on that? That would be a matter for my lawyers and the patent office, James said. I'm sure you understand I can't comment on potential industrial espionage during an ongoing investigation. The agent smiled slightly. Of course. Though it's interesting how that evidence surfaced just as we were building our case against Sterling Properties. Life is full of interesting timing, James replied. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a board meeting to attend. After Chen left, Mason called with updates from his contacts in the banking industry. It's a bloodbath. 3 banks have called in their loans. Sterling's entire house of cards is collapsing. They can't cover even 10% of their obligations. James opened his laptop, reviewing the latest financial reports. Sterling Properties stock had been suspended from trading after falling 60%. Investors were filing lawsuits by the hour. Construction sites stood abandoned as contractors fled the sinking ship. His phone buzzed again. A message from Rebecca's lawyer. My client is willing to provide testimony against Mr. Sterling in exchange for consideration from prosecutors. She was merely following orders. James deleted the message without finishing it. Rebecca's attempts to save herself were predictable but futile. The evidence trail he'd constructed implicated her too deeply in the fraud. Every loan application she'd approved, every document she'd falsified, every bribe she'd facilitated. All of it meticulously documented and provided to authorities. Dr. Morrison? His assistant's voice again. You have a call from Thomas Wright. Put him through. James. Wright's voice was desperate. You have to help me. The SEC is freezing my assets. They're saying I knew about the environmental violations, the fraudulent loans. Didn't you? James interrupted coldly. The Riverside Project alone, contaminated soil, endangered species habitat destroyed, falsified environmental impact studies. Your signature is on everything, Thomas. I'll testify against Sterling. I'll tell them everything. Goodbye, Thomas. James ended the call, turning back to his screens. The news coverage was intensifying. Drone footage showed environmental protesters at Sterling's development sites. Former employees were coming forward with more evidence of wrongdoing. Political allies were scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. A notification popped up, another message from Rebecca. You planned this all along, didn't you? While we thought you were broken, destroyed. You were really... James archived the message without reading further. Let her realize the truth now. Let her understand exactly who she betrayed. Dr. Patterson entered his office without knocking. The board meeting can wait, James interrupted, gesturing to his screens. Watch this. Live coverage showed Richard Sterling being led into FBI headquarters. The once proud real estate mogul looked shattered, his expensive suit wrinkled, his carefully maintained image crumbling along with his empire. You orchestrated all of this, Dr. Patterson said quietly. It wasn't a question. I simply provided evidence of criminal activity to the proper authorities, James replied. Everything else is just cause and effect. The timing, waiting until after the acquisition was announced, until after Rebecca's attempts to reopen the divorce settlement. James turned to face her. The research is real, Catherine. The breakthrough is legitimate. Everything else is just cleanup. She studied him for a long moment. You're not the man they thought you were. No, James agreed. I'm the man they made me become. His phone buzzed yet again. Isabella Martinez. Federal prosecutors are moving fast. Grand jury indictments coming within days. They're charging everything: bank fraud, wire fraud, environmental crimes, conspiracy. Keep me posted, James replied. And Isabella? Make sure your follow-up story emphasizes the environmental aspects. The public needs to understand the real damage Sterling's greed caused. He ended the call and stood at his window, watching FBI agents load more boxes into their vehicles. Somewhere in those boxes was every piece of evidence he'd spent months collecting. Every fraudulent document, every falsified report, every proof of Rebecca and Richard's crimes. All carefully gathered and preserved while they celebrated their supposed victory over him. Mason's voice came through his speakerphone. James, you need to see this. Sterling's trying to move assets through offshore accounts. Multiple transfers initiated in the last hour. Already flagged for the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. James replied. Watch what happens. On one of his screens, numbers began flowing. Accounts frozen, transfers reversed, assets seized. Richard's desperate attempts at hiding his illegal gains were being blocked in real time. How did you know? Mason asked. Because it's exactly what I would do, James answered. When people like Richard and Rebecca feel trapped, they become predictable. They follow patterns. All you have to do is anticipate their moves. His assistant's voice interrupted. Dr. Morrison? Rebecca Sterling is in the lobby. She's demanding to see you. James checked his security feeds. Rebecca stood at the reception desk, her designer outfit and perfect makeup a sharp contrast to her frantic expression. Have security escort her out, he instructed, and send the lobby footage to my lawyer. Let's add trespassing to her growing list of problems. He turned back to his screens, watching as more dominoes fell. Sterling Properties' international partners were cutting ties. Construction lenders were calling in their loans. Environmental agencies were issuing stop work orders across multiple projects. The research facility plans are ready for review, Dr. Patterson said, placing a tablet on his desk. The board approved the additional funding. James nodded, glancing at the designs for the new cancer research center that would rise from the ashes of his old life. The symmetry was perfect. The house where Rebecca and Richard had plotted to destroy him would become a place of healing, of progress, of hope. Sometimes, he said quietly, the best revenge isn't just destroying your enemies. It's using their destruction to build something better. Dr. Patterson studied him thoughtfully. You never intended to just walk away, did you? Even at the beginning? They thought I was weak, James replied. They thought I was defeated. That's the thing about people like Rebecca and Richard. They're so convinced of their own superiority that they never see the truth until it's too late. His phone buzzed one final time. Agent Shun. Dr. Morrison, we found something interesting in Miss Sterling's private files. Documents suggesting she was planning to sell your research data to a competitor. Would you be willing to provide a statement? Of course, Agent Shun, James replied, a cold smile playing at his lips. I'm always happy to assist federal authorities. He ended the call and turned back to his screens, watching as years of carefully constructed corruption crumbled in a single day. Richard and Rebecca had taught him valuable lessons about power, about betrayal, about the importance of appearing weak when you were strong. Now they would spend years learning their own lessons about the price of underestimating their enemies. Chapter 2. Justice Served. The federal courthouse hummed with tension as James strode through the security checkpoint. His testimony was scheduled for day 3 of what media outlets had dubbed the Sterling Properties scandal. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras flashing as he passed. Inside the courtroom, Richard and Rebecca sat at separate tables, their legal teams creating a physical barrier between them. Richard's usual polished appearance had deteriorated. His designer's suit hanging loose, dark circles under his eyes. Rebecca maintained her facade better, but her hands trembled as she arranged papers before her. All rise. The bailiff called as Judge Miranda Chen entered the courtroom. James took his place in the witness box, his posture relaxed, confident. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Williams approached, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Please state your name for the record. Dr. James Morrison. Dr. Morrison, what is your current position? I'm the head of research and development at PharmaCorp, overseeing the development of targeted cancer treatment technologies. And how do you know the defendants? Rebecca Sterling was my wife of 15 years before our divorce. Richard Sterling was initially her real estate client before becoming her lover and later, her husband. Rebecca's lawyer jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? It goes to establishing the witness's knowledge of the defendant's activities, Williams countered. Overruled, Judge Chen declared. Continue, Ms. Williams. The prosecutor methodically led James through his testimony. He described discovering financial irregularities, pattern of fraud, environmental violations. Each statement was supported by meticulous documentation, bank records, loan applications, internal memos. And these environmental impact reports? Williams held up a thick binder. Can you explain their significance? Those reports detail toxic contamination at the Riverside development site, James explained. Sterling Properties buried them and submitted falsified data to obtain building permits. Richard's lawyer, David Chun, attempted to discredit him during cross-examination. Isn't it true, Dr. Morrison, that this entire investigation stems from your desire for revenge? No, James replied calmly. It stems from evidence of multiple federal crimes. My personal history with the defendants simply made me more attentive to irregularities in their business practices. Yet you waited until after your divorce to bring these allegations forward? I reported everything to relevant authorities as evidence was discovered. The timing of their investigation is their prerogative, not mine. Rebecca's lawyer, Patricia Martinez, tried a different approach. Dr. Morrison, isn't it possible that my client was unaware of the full scope of these activities? That she was merely following Mr. Sterling's instructions? James turned to face Rebecca directly. Your client has 15 years of experience as a loan officer. She personally approved fraudulent applications, falsified documentation, and coordinated with Mr. Sterling to secure multiple loans using the same collateral. These actions required expertise and deliberate intent. During a recess, Isabella Martinez cornered him in the courthouse corridor. They're falling apart in there, she observed. Rebecca's team is already talking plea deal. Let them negotiate, James replied. The evidence speaks for itself. The trial continued for 3 weeks. Former Sterling Properties employees testified about systematic document destruction, buried environmental reports, and elaborate kickback schemes. Bank officials detailed the complex web of fraudulent loans. Environmental scientists presented evidence of irreversible damage to protected wetlands. Richard cracked first. Under intense cross-examination, he attempted to shift blame to Rebecca, claiming she had masterminded the loan fraud scheme. Rebecca retaliated by producing recorded conversations of Richard discussing bribes to city officials. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours. James sat perfectly still as the forewoman read the verdicts. Guilty on all counts. Bank fraud, wire fraud, environmental crimes, conspiracy, money laundering. As federal marshals led them away, Rebecca caught James's eye. For the first time, she saw him clearly, not as the passive husband she dismissed, but as the architect of her destruction. The realization in her eyes was worth more than any verbal confession. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed him. Dr. Morrison, what's your reaction to the verdict? Justice was served, he stated simply. The evidence was conclusive. Do you feel vindicated? This case wasn't about personal vindication, James replied. It was about holding people accountable for their crimes. The jury saw the evidence and made their decision. Back in his PharmaCorp office, Dr. Patterson waited with a bottle of expensive scotch. Quite a performance in there, she observed. You never once lost your composure. There was no need for emotion, James replied, accepting a glass. The facts were sufficient. His phone buzzed. Mason with updates on the asset seizures. Sterling Properties holdings were being liquidated, investors were filing civil suits, and banks were foreclosing on properties across the city. Chapter 3. New Beginnings. 1 year later, James stood on the lawn of his former home. Construction equipment surrounded the property, ready to begin its transformation into a state-of-the-art research facility. Dr. Patterson approached, carrying building plans. The renovation committee approved all modifications. We'll have 20 research stations, shared lab space, conference rooms, and a lecture hall. James nodded, surveying the property. And the grant applications? Coming in daily. Young scientists with promising research in cancer treatment, genetic disorders, rare diseases. The kind of work that usually struggles for funding. Approve them all, James instructed. Full funding, no strings attached. His phone buzzed. Isabella updating him on Richard and Rebecca. Their appeals had been denied. They were serving their sentences in separate federal facilities. Their requests for minimum security placement rejected due to the sophistication of their crimes. You know, Dr. Patterson said carefully, some people think you went too far, that you could have stopped after the acquisition was announced. James watched a group of graduate students touring the grounds, their excitement visible as they discussed research possibilities. They chose to destroy my life for their own amusement, he replied. They needed to learn that actions have consequences. He gestured to the students. Look what came of it. A breakthrough treatment that will save lives, opportunities for young scientists, a corrupt developer exposed. Sometimes good things come from dark places. And Rebecca and Richard? Serving 12 to 15 years. Richard's cellmate is apparently quite fond of him. James allowed himself a small smile. Life has a way of balancing the scales. They walked back to their cars, James feeling not joy but completion. He had lost a wife but gained something more valuable. The knowledge that he was stronger than anyone had imagined, capable of both great achievement and terrible retribution. The research facility would stand as his legacy. Not the revenge he had taken, but the good he had created from it. That was the final lesson, the one Rebecca and Richard would never understand. True power wasn't in destroying things, but in building something meaningful from the destruction. In their separate prison cells, Rebecca and Richard would have years to contemplate their mistake in underestimating the quiet scientist they thought they could destroy. The price of betrayal had been high indeed, but the returns, measured in lives saved, discoveries made, and justice served, would be higher still. James started his car, taking one last look at the property that had witnessed both his humiliation and his triumph. The past was settled. The future beckoned. And somewhere in federal prison, two people who had taught him about cruelty were learning their own lessons about consequences. Epilogue. 5 years later. James Morrison adjusted his tie as he prepared to deliver the keynote speech at the International Cancer Research Symposium. Through the backstage curtain, he could see Dr. Patterson in the front row, now Chief Medical Officer at PharmaCorp, beaming with pride. Their targeted cancer treatment system had exceeded all expectations, with survival rates tripling in previously untreatable cases. And now, the announcer's voice boomed through the auditorium, please welcome Dr. James Morrison, whose breakthrough in targeted drug delivery has revolutionized cancer treatment worldwide. As James took the stage, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Mason Hayes with his monthly update on the past that refused to stay buried. Rebecca Sterling, inmate number 2-47896, had been denied parole for the third time. The parole board cited her lack of genuine remorse and continued attempts to minimize her role in the fraud scheme. She'd aged dramatically in federal prison, her designer clothes replaced by standard-issue khaki, her perfectly manicured hands now rough from mandatory work detail. Richard Sterling hadn't fared much better. Inmate number 2-47895 spent his days in a different federal facility, his multiple appeals exhausted, his attempts to maintain his wealthy lifestyle behind bars repeatedly denied. His former political connections had abandoned him, his letters to former associates returned unopened. The key to progress, James began his speech, isn't just in scientific breakthrough, but in making those breakthroughs accessible to everyone. He gestured to the screens behind him, showing the Morrison Research Institute. His former home transformed into a thriving research facility. 25 young scientists currently worked there, their projects fully funded, their discoveries already saving lives. In the audience, Isabella Martinez took notes for her latest book. Her exposé on the Sterling property scandal had won a Pulitzer, launching her career as a leading investigative journalist. She now ran her own news site, specializing in corporate corruption investigations. 5 years ago, James continued, we made a promise to change the landscape of cancer treatment. Today, I'm proud to announce we've exceeded that promise. He didn't mention that this very morning, Rebecca had attempted to contact him again. Her latest letter, like all the others, had been marked "Returned to Sender" without being opened. She tried everything: apologies, explanations, pleas for help with her appeal. James had remained silent, letting her words echo unanswered in her prison cell. After his speech, During the reception, Dr. Patterson handed him a tablet showing the latest news. Thomas Wright, Richard's former biggest investor, had just pleaded guilty in a separate fraud case. His attempt to rebuild his empire after the Sterling scandal had led to more criminal charges. "Did you know?" Dr. Patterson asked, studying his reaction. "Mason flagged some irregularities in Wright's new ventures 6 months ago," James replied. "Anonymous tip to the SEC took care of the rest." The Morrison Research Institute had just approved its 100th grant, funding research into rare genetic disorders. The scientific community had taken notice. 3 Nobel nominations had come from work done in its labs. Meanwhile, Rebecca spent her days in the prison library, obsessively reading every article about James's success. Her attempts to claim credit for supporting his early research had become a running joke among the guards. Her prison therapist noted her inability to accept responsibility for her actions, her continued belief that she was somehow the victim. Richard had taken a different approach to imprisonment. He tried to write a memoir, painting himself as the victim of a vindictive ex-husband's elaborate revenge scheme. No publisher would touch it. His former allies in the real estate world pretended they'd never heard of him. The environmental damage from his projects had taken years to address. The contaminated soil at the Riverside development had required a massive cleanup effort. The protected wetlands he'd destroyed were slowly being restored, funded by the proceeds from his seized assets. Mason Hayes had parlayed his role in exposing the Sterling fraud into a successful corporate investigation firm. His company specialized in uncovering financial crimes, with a particular focus on real estate fraud. He still sent James regular updates on Rebecca and Richard, knowing his friend liked to stay informed. The future of medical research, James concluded his speech, lies not in corporate profits, but in giving brilliant minds the freedom to pursue breakthrough discoveries. The applause was thunderous. In the audience, young scientists from the Morrison Institute cheered their mentor. Many of them had heard rumors about the facility's history, about the personal drama behind its creation, but James never discussed it. Later that evening, in his penthouse office at PharmaCorp, James reviewed the latest reports. The cancer treatment system had been approved in 30 more countries. The Morrison Institute was expanding, adding a new wing for advanced genetic research. His personal fortune, built on the PharmaCorp acquisition and subsequent breakthroughs, had grown exponentially. His phone buzzed, Isabella with more updates. Richard's former lawyer, David Chun, had been disbarred for his role in covering up the environmental violations. Several city officials implicated in the bribery scandal had served their sentences and been released, their careers and reputations destroyed. The scandal had sparked major reforms in real estate development and banking regulations. New laws required stricter environmental reviews, enhanced fraud prevention measures, and greater transparency in property dealings. Isabella's reporting had earned her a position on the governor's corporate crime task force. Rebecca's daughter from her first marriage, now in college, had legally changed her surname, distancing herself from her mother's crimes. She'd written James a letter, thanking him for funding her scientific scholarship through an anonymous donation. He'd never replied, but continued to monitor her academic progress. Richard's ex-wife had written a scathing memoir about their marriage, revealing years of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. The book had become a bestseller, with Wright's option for a streaming series. Richard's request to block the publication had been denied by prison authorities. James's new house, a modern mansion overlooking the city, contained no mementos of his previous life. The only reminder was a single framed news article announcing the Sterling Properties scandal verdict, hung in his private study. Not for vengeance, but for remembrance. Dr. Patterson joined him in his office, carrying preliminary results from their latest trials. "The new delivery system is showing even better results than projected," she reported. "We're seeing complete remission in cases that were considered hopeless." "Expand the trial," James instructed. "I want this treatment available to everyone, regardless of their ability to pay." His phone buzzed again. Mason's final update for the day. Rebecca had been caught trying to run an investment scheme from prison, using contraband phones to contact potential victims. Her parole prospects, already slim, were now non-existent. Richard had suffered a minor stroke, his health deteriorating under the stress of imprisonment. His request for transfer to a minimum security facility had been denied again. The once proud real estate mogul now shuffled through prison corridors with a cane, avoided by other inmates who knew his story. The Morrison Institute had become a beacon in the scientific community, its reputation for groundbreaking research growing with each passing year. The house that had witnessed James's humiliation now witnessed daily breakthroughs in human knowledge. You know, Dr. Patterson said, reviewing the trial data, sometimes I think about that day you accepted our offer. If Rebecca and Richard hadn't betrayed you, everything has consequences, James replied simply. They chose their path. I chose mine. He turned to his window, looking out at the city where Richard Sterling had once wielded so much power. The corrupt empire had crumbled, its ruins transformed into something beneficial to humanity. It was a different kind of revenge, more complete than any prison sentence. Years had passed, but the lessons remained. Rebecca and Richard had taught him about betrayal, about the darkness in human nature. He had taught them about consequences, about the danger of underestimating those they thought they could destroy. In their separate prison cells, they had years left to contemplate these lessons. James had moved forward, his success a daily reminder of their foolishness. They had tried to write the end of his story, never realizing they were only writing the beginning of their own downfall. The price of betrayal had been high, but its returns, measured in lives saved, discoveries made, and justice served, had proven higher still. Sometimes, James reflected, the best revenge wasn't just in destroying your enemies, but in building something magnificent from the ashes of their betrayal. The sun set over the city as James returned to his work, focused on the future while the architects of his past languished in their cells, forgotten by all except those who wanted to remember the price of their betrayal. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.